You've probably heard many Christians claim that the Bible is unlike any story ever written. This attempt to elevate the myth onto a different level is disingenuous. In reality, the Bible belongs right next to other similar narratives like the Epic of Gilgamesh. And this is not at all a bad thing. For this video, we're going to take a look at some of the characteristics of the Bible that lead us to conclude it's an archetypal myth. There are over 200 flood myths dating back to the earliest civilizations and even the earliest written story, the Epic of Gilgamesh. These flood myths are nearly ubiquitous and come from all different cultures all around the world. And I hear this argument a lot. Maybe they're all referencing a common real event. At first glance, this sounds like a good argument, but we have to realize that there's absolutely no consensus on the date of the flood. For example, take the Hebrew Bible, read it literally, and you get the flood occurred around 2400 BCE. Look at the Epic of Gilgamesh, and you get that the flood happened 2700 BCE or even before. Then, using modern technology, if we look at archaeological evidence for a flood, we see one 15,000 years ago, so even further back, and it's in a different continent. So no, I don't think that we're looking at a common event, rather a common production of the human mind is this concept of flood. Another characteristic of the Hebrew Bible that suggests it's a myth is its creation narrative, which is extremely similar to the Egyptian creation narrative. Both narratives have this idea of a firmament that was created around the world that in the future is broken. They also both have a similar mechanism for creation, and that is the spoken word. Again, in Egyptian mythology, we also have humans being created in the image of God. We also have the creation of humans out of dust or out of clay. We see this in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the Hebrew Bible, and in many Akkadian myths. So I'll stop here for the Old Testament similarities because I think a lot of people discount the Old Testament as it's kind of weird. A lot of Christians, for example, don't really think about it. And so we're going to focus in instead on the New Testament and go through additional details to show the New Testament is just as mythological as the Old Testament. One of the main things that distinguishes Jesus from all other characters, supposedly, is the fact that he bridges the gap between two worlds. He's fully God and he's fully mortal. However, the issue is that we see this exact archetype play over hundreds and hundreds of times. It's a recycled myth. In fact, we see in the first ever hero whose story was written down in the Epic of Gilgamesh, we have the main character, King Gilgamesh, is a demigod. He is half god, half human. Again, he's bridging that gap between life and death, just like Jesus is. Being born a virgin, this was not a unique event. Dionysus did it first over 1,000 years before Jesus was ever conceptualized. Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy, was born of a virgin, and he was the product of his father Zeus and his mother Persephone. We also have Apollonius of Tyana being born of a virgin, and his narrative was actually cycling around culture the same time that Jesus was. Dionysus, as we mentioned in the previous segment, was not only born a virgin, but he also died and resurrected. And actually it was Zeus that resurrected Dionysus after he was cut into a bunch of pieces. We see Osiris in Egyptian mythology also die and resurrect. A god associated with the death and rebirth of vegetation named Attis also dies and resurrects. Both Tammuz, I think is how you pronounce it, and Adonis also have this exact same motif going on, where they enter the underworld and come back. So we get back to Dionysus again. He was very popular for running around and performing miracles similar to Jesus, and he performed what was the classic Dionysian miracle, which was turning water into wine. Yes, even the water into wine motif that is so connected to the character of Jesus was stolen. It wasn't even his. Also, when you think of Jesus, you might think of walking on water, like what a unique event that could occur in somebody's narrative. He wasn't the first to do this either. Actually, Orion was. We'll have to get more into Dionysus in another video because some of the parallels are just incredible. Here's the last one, is that Dionysus also rode a donkey into the promised land. So I think we can stop there for now and ask a couple questions. Christians will look at the similarities amongst different stories in the Old Testament and New Testament and conclude that it is this cohesive narrative. So why can't they also accept these connections between just the global environment of mythology? Yes, there are similarities and connections that can be made from the Old Testament to the New Testament, but also from the Epic of Gilgamesh through the story of Christ. Christians, for example, like to look at prophecies and say, these things that were alluded to in the Old Testament that came true in the New Testament are virtually impossible to have happened by chance. But what are the chances you have the character like Jesus, who is essentially a repeat of the character of Dionysus? What are the chances that he feels these exact same things, that he's turning water into wine, that he's walking on water, that he's that he dies and resurrects, that he's half God, half human, all these things. It's simply, in my view, not possible that he is a completely unique character. It is clear to me that he is copying characters before him. And so what does this mean? Jesus is simply a continuation of the mythological story of humanity that is stretched back to the dawn of civilization. So why do people elevate the story of the Bible, the story of Jesus? Why do they elevate it so high that it becomes essentially a cult and like a religious practice? My theory is that the narratives we create are reflections of who we are. Jesus, Gilgamesh. They're not these people out there roaming the world or that did roam the world and had some great impact. They're within us. They're parts of who we are. But as we progress, a hero like Gilgamesh, for example, no longer is applicable, no longer relates to our culture. And so today, looking back at Gilgamesh, it's like, how could anybody believe such a ridiculous narrative of this guy who was 18 foot tall and half God, half human? What we have to recognize is that many, many thousands of years from now, people are going to look back at 2022 and be like, why did anybody believe in this guy Jesus who turned water into wine and walked on water and performed miracles and supposedly came back from the dead? When these myths go out of fashion, when they no longer relate to who we are as a collective, they are replaced. Nobody worships King Gilgamesh like they used to. And there will be a day, I know the Christians will hate this, that nobody will worship Jesus. I think it's so important for us not to focus on what makes Jesus different, or on what makes Gilgamesh different, but rather to focus on the similarities, because those similarities that reflect our nature most accurately. It's those similarities that will survive in future myths and forever echo the history of humanity. And that's not to say the myths don't build on each other, that Jesus is not different from Gilgamesh. He is, but he's much more similar than he is different. But to only look at the sliver that is most rooted in our culture is like trying to appreciate a painting by looking at a 1-inch box. You'll never see the full picture. If you want to learn more about mythology, psychology, religion, make sure to like this video and subscribe for future videos. I will see you on the next one.